One could spend a lifetime studying the Council of Trent, as the famous scholar Herbert Jourdain did, in whose magisterial text goes through the nitty-gritty of the details about the council, both the run-up to the council and what went on during the council. Although John O'Malley has given us a more concise treatment of what occurred at the Council of Trent recently. Regardless, when it comes to the study of the council, what we'll be focusing on here for the purpose of this lecture is we'll talk a little bit first about why it took so long for a general council to emerge as a response to the Protestants. I'll go through the roughly kind of the history of the council and its particulars as it's sat in sort of three different periods. And then I'll go through the doctrinal and then the reform measures of the council, and then talk a little bit about implementation, particularly vis-a-vis the papacy of Pius V. So the Council of Trent, while it was not too little, some can say it was maybe too late. It is probably the most important doctrinal council since the Council of Nicaea. And hopefully this lecture will help give you a little bit more of the historical context for statements that you mostly come across in dogmatics. So there were some attempts to try to deal with the Protestant issue that didn't use the General Council. And partially this is because the delay over the council will be so long. Paul III will call for a general council in 1536, but there will be a lot of missteps and inability of people to agree. What's really going on here in this inability of people to agree about a general council is that there's a lot of different competing forces. The main one is the war between France and the Empire. Means France is opposed to a general council because anything that helps Charles is bad for France in the perspective of the House of Valois. Also, Charles V doesn't want to deal with the Lutherans and the Protestants with a national council. He thinks that as Holy Roman Emperor, there really ought to be a universal council to deal with this issue. And then the papacy is caught between the difficulties over being an ally of France and not wanting to upset the emperor. And then there are other forces thinking that they can resolve the issue of the Protestants without recourse to a council. So there's lots of different energies and strategies that are preventing the council from coming together. Because the council was so long in coming together, because the first session won't meet until March of 1545, there were some attempts to create unity through dialogue, and this is called the Regensburg Dialogue. This idea here is that it was talks, especially between Johannes Eck and Philip Melanchthon, um, adding to that John Groper and Martin Bousset, which is tries to create a compromise understanding of justification. The model that they put forward is that Luther's justification occurred first, and then this is followed up by a more traditional understanding of justification. Nobody likes this compromise model. So this effort of dialogue, of unity by dialogue, was tried by Charles V, but it was proved to be wanting. Hadrian VI recognized very clearly during his very short pontificate that cleaning up the abuses within the church, especially reforming financial abuses in the church, was going to be an important step in healing the church. That basically the leadership of the church had to live up to their responsibilities better if they were going to gain any ground in drawing the Protestants back into the church. His short pontificate shows that there could be reform-minded popes, but really, it's Hadrian's pontificate was so short that he wasn't able to get any traction further for his reform efforts before he died. The Protestants have been clamoring for a council. I'm not really sure why. They call for a general free Christian council, which basically for them means no pope. So I'm not really sure why they want a council, because they want to automatically exclude the papacy. from the beginning. If you look again at the Schismatic articles laid out by Luther, you see that there's nothing of a compromise that the Protestants really want. So, what Protestants probably want is a free council based on scripture alone and sort of a universal repeat of the pre-decided debate, say in Zurich for Zwingli, those sorts of things. But still, there are many people at the time, even in the 1530s and 40s, that don't feel that Exsurge Domini and Decet Romanum closed the book on the Luther question. Most of these people are conciliarists. So there is still a desire that a council come together, but it will be delayed because of the lack of support from France. But eventually, Paul III will call the council. This in itself shows, in a way, kind of the disease is deciding to heal itself. Paul III was kind of your typical Renaissance Pope enjoying the papacy, but even he saw the need for a reform-oriented council for making the necessary changes in the church to improve the life of the whole church. One of the things that Paul III commissioned was a committee to go out and figure out what was going on in the church. And this is document 102 in the Jance Reader, put together by Cardinals Contarini and Carafa. And you can see very, very clearly there that it's an honest assessment of especially the dire impact that avarice has had on the life of the church. Of course, this report gets leaked, and the Protestants just hold it up to further demonstrate their superiority to the church. Because the council was delayed, one of the other things that Paul III will do is he will put a papal bull out, which is licet ab initio. And what is it possible to begin? It's possible to begin the permanent seating of the Roman Inquisition, and it'll be first staffed by Cardinal Carafa. And so the Roman Inquisition is formally established in 1542 and will continue to be an important piece of the life of the church even to today, even though it has, instead of the Holy Office, the Sacred Office of the Holy Inquisition, it's now called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, but that Roman Inquisition still exists with us today. Eventually, France will get on board with the idea that we need to have a general council. This is primarily because France starts to have their own Protestant problems in the mid 1530s, thanks to Geneva. But eventually, the powers that be are finally able to settle on Trent. Trent is a compromised position. It's on the Italian peninsula, it's in the empire, and therefore it's seen to be kind of neutral. It's not too Italian and it's not too German. When the council finally will come together, the goal of the council will be threefold. One, to solve the Protestant problems. Two, to provide theological clarifications. And three, to root out abuse within the life of the church. So the council will sit in three different periods. So from March 1545 to the winter of 1547, and then move to Bologna briefly due to typhoid fever, and then May of 1551 to May of 1552, and then April 1561 to December of 1563. In the first setting in 1545 to 47, the initial attendance was really low. Charles V was upset that people were not moving very quickly with reforms, and this is the context for the way of dialogue that he tried to do. The initial presidents of this are Del Monte, Crevini, and Pole. That's Reginald Pole, who would eventually become Archbishop of Canterbury. And you can really see the desire. The two tensions come very clearly in this first period is what do we work on? Do we work on doctrine or do we work on reform? And those from the German world want to do reform of abuses first, and those particularly from the Italian world want to defend doctrine first. And the grand compromise on the part of the Council of Trent is to do both at the same time and to do reform measures that are connected usually pretty concretely to the doctrinal statements that are being made at the same time. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail here in the next slide. But let's come back to the general history of the council before we dig into the particulars of what Trent said. May of 1551 to May of 1552, the council is reconvened by a new pope, this time Julius III. Protestants came to this one, but it was too late because of the doctrinal statements, as particularly the decree on justification in 1547. It was too late for them to really say anything, but they did come. They did say they didn't like what they found and they left, and they did this all under safe conduct. The council in this session will have to be suspended because there was an army nearby and a Protestant army, and the bishops felt that it was a danger to be still at Trent with a danger next so close. Then there will be a gap of 10 years, and this is because Cardinal Carafa became Paul IV, and Paul IV was not committed at all to a council and decided that it was a hazard more than a help, and decided to try to pursue other means, such as the use of the Inquisition, to deal with the problem. Now, this is an important factor as well. You have to remember that popes don't like councils. Every time councils met in the 15th century, the popes lost authority, income, or both. And so the popes themselves are not really pro-council at this position, and Cardinal Carafa as Paul IV shows the more default anti-conciliarist attitude on the part of the papacy. Nevertheless, the council's work continued um, by being taken back up again in April of 1561 during the pontificate of Pius IV. And here it's really a generational shift if you think about it. Most bishops, unless they're appointed very young, will have died in the space of 20 years. And so there really is kind of a whole shift of personnel. So one of the things that the 1561 session will do will reaffirm all the previous work that had come before. France is even more on board by now because they really have a Protestant problem. And especially Cardinal Morone was in charge as president of this council, and he was able to negotiate this kind of Italian and Spanish desire to defend doctrine and the German need for robust reforms, and he was able to kind of keep everyone together, and this will eventually lead to the council being able to move forward and actually to have votes and to pass the decrees and the canons that they did. You can also see by the time we move into this final phase that the new orders, the observant orders, were influential, but especially there are strong influences by the Jesuit theologians Salmeron and Lainez as advisors and preachers to this council within its last session. So it's probably a small miracle that the Council of Trent was able to successfully navigate 20 years of back and forth and four pontificates. But in the end, voting was going to be normal, not the kind of strange way of constance. It was going to be voting by bishop. And it's with all of this done that they're able to pass a huge amount of legislation for the life of the church, both in terms of doctrine and reform. And so we'll first turn our attention to the doctrine, and then when we finish with some of the highlights of doctrine, we'll discuss the reforms. But before I can do that, I just wanted to show you this passage from Guy Bedoui, a church historian out of Strasbourg's, from the Catholic Reform text, showing this idea of what saved the Council of Trent, which is connecting together the doctrine with reforms. So, the doctrine of holy orders was challenged by the Protestants, the priesthood of all believers, and also the idea of a priest as office and not as in any way sacramentally different than the rest of Christianity, the rest of the Christians. And so the doctrine of holy orders is defended, but the reform that's added to it to go right along with the doctrinal decree is that the call of bishops of priests to holy orders needs to be with much more intense scrutiny, and then also it lays out the canon, it lays out the reform orders for the establishment of seminaries for every diocese, or at least every diocese that can afford it. So you can kind of see how there's a statement of this is the doctrine, and then there's some reforming decrees to support the kind of inherent understanding of that doctrine. It doesn't always work, but you can see that they go hand in hand. So if people are fallen, and we're going to tell you what that means in original sin, then they need to have good teaching and preaching to help them overcome that original sin. If people are going to be uh, set out on the pathway to salvation in the decree of justification, then they need to have pastors to provide them the sacraments, so that we need to make sure that bishops and priests are resident. So it really is kind of this combination of these things that leads to the saving of the Council of Trent. It's by kind of placating both sides of the church. And when we talk about reform now, you can kind of divide all of early modern Catholic reform initiatives into kind of two categories. You can call them kind of offensive and defensive. Offensive is kind of Catholic reform dedicated to helping us to live out the ideal better. And defensive is counter reform, Catholic counter reforms meant to defend the church against the bad ideas of the Protestants. And this sort of offensive and defensive mentalities sometimes can conflict with each other, particularly if the innovations on the Catholic reform, the offense side, seem a little different or strange, then the defensive side will kind of counter it. But the two kind of mentalities are operative in the 16th century at the same time, and they lead to a number of the tools that the church will use to respond to the Protestants. But they're kind of these two groups, the Catholic Reform, which is about helping us to live the ideal better, and then the Counter Reform, which is about defense. But if you are really interested in kind of the language of how do we describe Catholic reform in the early modern period, early modern Catholicism, there's an excellent book by O'Malley called Trent and All That, which goes through in great detail the difficulty over what do you call the kind of reforming movements of the church in the 16th century. Because if you call it all counter reform, then somehow you make it all connected to the Protestants, of which it's not. But if you call it all Catholic reform, you don't recognize the fact that some of the steps taken by the members of the church in the 16th and 17th century were directly connected to countering the Protestants. So there's kind of a linguistic label war that's been going on in history for a while over these terms. But in terms of the way that I like to describe it, is that the offense is Catholic reform and the defense is Catholic counter reform. One of the things that the decree of justification did do that I'm sure Luther would not like is that it took away Luther's certitude about his own salvation. So Luther's idea that once you have faith, you can be absolutely certain that you'll be fine. For the Council Fathers, that's not enough. Having faith is not enough. Instead, it is all a matter of cooperating with God's grace all the way until the end. So in terms of other things that the Council of Trent did doctrinally, of course, it is one of the most important of councils for sacraments, although the Council of Florence, Ferrara, Basil, Florence, Ferrara had said out quite a bit, especially in the decree of the Armenians. Trent's statements on the sacraments are the most robust dogmatic statements about the sacraments in the church. So obvious there in 47, they put out a quick list of canons of things with how the Protestants are wrong, but then in 1551, they came back and set out more positive statements about the sacraments. There are, of course, 7 of the sacraments. They are necessary for our salvation. The priests are the ones who distribute these sacraments. There's statements against Donatism. There's a reaffirmation that grace is affected by the administration of sacraments, regardless, that the Eucharist is truly present in either species, although one species is the norm. And also, they reaffirmed the language about transubstantiation for the Eucharist. With regard to what they say about the Eucharist, Christ is truly, really substantially contained in the Eucharist, and Jesus can be both at the right hand of the Father and in the Eucharist, so that's against the Extra Calvinisticum, and that the Eucharist is spiritual food and forgiveness of sins, but also the fruit of the sacrament is unity. Only in the Eucharist is the author of the sacrament present before its use. And here in the kind of long trajectory of sacramental theology, you can see where the Eucharist is becoming sort of the more important of the two motors of sacramental theology moving forward. At session 13 in paragraph 4, you can see what they say about transubstantiation, which is to say that there is a substantial change, and this the church calls transubstantiation. So you don't have to be a Thomist, you don't have to be an Aristotelian, you just have to call that this substantial change while the accidents remain. So you need a couple categories from Aristotle, but beyond that, you're not necessarily locked into a Thomistic understanding of transubstantiation. To meet the bare minimum, you just have to call what happens, you need to call it transubstantiation. Because the author of the sacrament is indeed present before its use, then of course adoration is good, reservation is good, and also you must confess mortal sins before you communicate. There was some debate about whether or not to open up on both species, but they decided to leave it up to the Pope to decide. And there is quite a robust push on the part of the Council Fathers to enjoin and beg people after they have obviously confessed their mortal sins to come to frequent reception of the sacraments. So there's other important things about the sacraments that you'll get in your sacraments class, but at least in terms of responding to the Protestants, especially with regard to the Eucharist, you can see Trent confirming and defending the traditional view of what occurs in the sacraments. Other places where this occurs, where they're kind of overriding the Protestant challenges in terms of confession and penance, reconciliation, justice demands satisfaction, and therefore, if that is the case, then um, things like indulgences are okay, but they do abolish any base gain that people attempt to achieve with the indulgences, but they confirm indulgences. In terms of the sacrificial character of the Mass, firmly rejected by the Protestants, not only do the Council Fathers reaffirm it, declaring the Mass to be a representation and a bloodless offering of Christ, and that the outward signs that have been established are there to move people as established by the tradition, but they intimately connect the sacrificial character of the Mass to the Eucharist to holy orders itself. And they work on holy orders in sessions 22 and 23. Holy orders are instituted by Christ, ordered especially towards the Eucharist and the sacrificial character, because they intimately are connected to Christ's priesthood through the indelible character. So, really, what happens is kind of the three things most under attack by the Protestant in the life of the church, besides the question of justification, of salvation, was priesthood, Eucharist, and the sacrificial nature of the Mass. And the Council Fathers make those 3 points mutually buttressing of each other in how they put forward their position. Purgatory is affirmed. Masses for the dead are great, but there is statements about rooting out superstition. Saints are great, images are great, relics are great, everything, all, pilgrimages, all of it's good according to the council, but always with an added statement of rooting out abuse when it came to the practice of these things. Despite what some of the Italian bishops were saying, doctrinal clarity is not sufficient for responding to the needs of the time in the 16th century. The Church also enacted reform measures through the Council of Trent to eliminate abuses and, most importantly, to lay out a blueprint for how the faith of the Church and of the everyday believer can be increased. And here, the great gamble of the Council Fathers at Trent is to place the bishop and the parish priest at the epicenter of all reform efforts, especially the bishop. The Council of Trent will cut through generations, centuries of ecclesiastical red tape and re-empower bishops to have greater direct control over their diocese. But they will also then accompany all of these duties laid, these powers that are given back to the bishops. There will be a great push for bishops to do their job. And if they don't do their job, and this is one of the great insights of the Holy Spirit at the Council of Trent, the bishops will be fined. So Lateran V had lots of reform decrees but didn't have teeth. But if with Trent, if you violate the decrees of Trent, not only will you be anathematized, but you'll be financially hit hard for breaking the canons of Trent. And there, um, you can appeal to the better or lesser angels on the part of people who are working in the church. So the Protestants claim to be about they're the only ones who preach the gospel, and so the Council of Trent will put in place the admonition that gospel instruction and preaching must occur, especially at Sundays and feast days, and if you don't, you're going to lose your income. And it's not just for parishes and in dioceses, but also in monasteries as convents and well. But to go along with this, bishops will have more robust control over who can preach um, in their own diocese, even having supervision over the regulars in their diocese. So this reestablishment of episcopal power is really kind of the key here. The popes are voluntarily limiting the power of appeal, what people can appeal to. The power over ordaining in the diocese is really emphasized as a moment of supervision. So really, when it comes to sort of clerical quality in the medieval church and into the early modern church, there's just as much focus on sort of what we would call ongoing formation or continuing formation as there is on pre-formation, as on training the priest at the beginning. But here you'll see at the Council of Trent, there is a much more robust effort to make sure that training of priests is improved and that the bishop is the one who needs to have oversight over this. No one should preach or be a confessor without episcopal approval within a diocese. So no one's supposed to be a bishop that is not of age and worthy. There's decrees against pluralism, that benefices should only go to the worthy. Pluralists um, from the seventh session forward will be are deprived of their benefices. You can just kind of go on with a number of these things, but it really is an effort to give the bishops back the authority they need to supervise the spiritual health of their diocese. And the main tools that the bishops are supposed to use in order to supervise people are tools that have been around in the church before, but they continue to be advocated by Trent, which is annual synods, triennial provincial synods, and annual visitations. So all of these tools can be used by the bishops in order to help the spiritual health of their diocese. The long normal list occurs in there. There's decrees against simony, against nepotism. There is a caution about overusing excommunication. It there's rejection of lay patronage to some extent. There's even decrees against dueling. You'll be automatically excommunicated for it. But probably the long-term health of the church in the reform measures of Trent comes from the establishment of seminaries in 109. So ordination is now supposed to only be for those that have been educated, trained, and thoroughly examined. The Council Fathers did not really focus on the relationship between the Pope and his brother bishops, and the papal representatives kept it off the books as much as they could. One of the other reforming measures are that nuns do get more robustly cloistered at this period, that they are not supposed to come out of their convents. And the other, probably actually for your own life as a future parish priest, one of the most important documents is Tamet Si, which lays out the need for getting church approval for your marriage. So it's trying to prevent clandestine marriages. It's the publication of the bans, all of that sort of stuff that's kind of in canon law and will be really important for you helping couples through marriage. But this kind of telling people you're going to get married and then getting license from the church sort of to be married, all of that is made much more formal at the Council of Trent and will now make you mini canon lawyers a little bit when it comes to dealing with marriages. As Pius IV was on his deathbed, the council decided to wrap up its work and move quickly to its end, and Pius IV will go ahead and approve everything that was passed by the council with Benedictus Deus on the 26th of January, 1564. Now, the immediate question comes about the reception of the council. Portugal, Venice, and the Catholic portions of Switzerland let the council be published right away and received it fully. Charles V approved it, but the German Diet did not, and over the course of 50 years, each Catholic principality slowly ratified pieces of Trent. The Polish king approved it, and the parliament refused it. France refused it outright, citing Gallican liberties, and only accepted the doctrinal part in 1615. Spain approved of it, but of course on its own terms. So always with something like a council, especially the Council of Trent, it's not just what is said, but it's how it's received. And so that we'll have to talk a little bit more about the reception of the Council of Trent as we move forward. The Council Fathers, by entrusting the work to the Holy Father in order to be done, while not necessarily affirming papal supremacy in light of the history of the 15th century, nevertheless are confirming papal authority. The Fathers had set up a number of commissions, and it's going to be Pope Pius V who's going to see the work of those commissions through, and then the fruits of those commissions will be published under his own authority. Pope St. Pius V, Michel Ghislieri, who's pope from 1566 to 1572, was not like Leo X, and he decided to actually enforce the general council that he received. He's an austere man himself, constantly in prayer, fasting, lived in a very simple cell. He had been Grand Inquisitor under Paul IV. Sort of kind of an indication of the type of person that Pius V was. He passed sumptuary laws for Rome, and the hope was for all of Christendom, limiting luxury in the cardinals and church officials, expelled prostitutes from Rome, and took a look around at all of the pagan art and said, you know what, I don't need this, and gave it to the Roman people, which is the foundation of the Capitoline Museum collection. He was even known for baldeurizing art, so putting up fig leaves on the people he thought were not sufficiently dressed. This is, of course, the same Pope who excommunicated Elizabeth. The bull was meant to support a coordinated rebellion, but that rebellion had been put down before it was published. So he is clearly someone who's willing to use his authority for both the disciplining of the Catholic world and even the disciplining of far reaches of the Catholic world. And he would prove that the council was the solution to the problems at hand. So, as a model of piety himself, we can see that the days of the Renaissance papacy were over. One of the secret to the Council of Trent was bishops doing their job, and so Pius sent bishops and clerics home. Probably and he also abolished the privileges of the canons at St. Peter's. Bishops that refused to go home, he imprisoned them in Castle San Angelo until they agreed to say yes. And two structural kind of additions that Pius V used for making sure that bishops continued to do their jobs is sort of the proto-beginning of what we would see now as ad limina visits of bishops checking in with papacy, but also, most importantly, the establishment of the congregation for the council. This is the congregation to oversee whether or not the council is being implemented. This is the congregation that will fine you, and this is the one that will enforce the disciplines on bishops and priests that refuse to do their jobs. So this success of reform at Rome is indicative of how reform went in the rest of Christendom, which is that it was highly dependent on the will of the bishop and often required the cooperation of the state and the Pope as well in order to get some of these reforms through. Pius V only appointed virtuous cardinals as well, which sort of broke some of the tenor of the Renaissance papacy as well. There's three important tools that Pius V published as Pope under his authority for helping the life of the church. And these three tools you can see is some of the most important instruments of reform. And these are, of course, the Roman Missal, the Roman Breviary, and the Roman Catechism. Before Pius V, none of this existed in the way that we think about it. So let's talk about the Catechism. The Catechism was begun in the last weeks of the Council. It was continued by Charles Borromeo, who was in the Papal Curia, and published in 1566. It is clear, it's concise, it gets the word out on the street. It was inspired by Peter Canisius, but it's very Thomistic. It's meant for parish priests, and it is now officially the statement of what we believe, and the Pope is publishing it under his authority. The Missale Romanum is finished in 1570, and this is the response to the Protestant liturgical challenge. The response to the Protestant liturgical challenge is uniformity. Everyone will now follow and do what Pope Pius V has put into the Missale Romanum, unless they have a good excuse of certain antiquity. But basically, this is one of the most robust developments in liturgical history up to date in the church. The papacy is taking over full control over the liturgy in the West in a way that hadn't really been ever done before. The closest parallel might have been Charlemagne in his promotion of the sacramentary of Hadrian. But the Missale Romanum is a return to the font sources, kind of a humanist inspiration. It cleans up some problems in there in the Missale, in various missals that it looked at, mostly problems with votive mass cycles. And the mass that is put in place is often described as a rubric mass, which basically is you will do exactly what it says in the book, and if you don't do what it says in the book, you will incur the Pope's extreme displeasure. Read for that, automatic excommunication. So this is do the red and say the black. It'll be slightly revised in 1604 and 1634, but mostly what Pius V put down is put down in place. So now this is a common identity for all. This is a one version of doing the Mass that everyone will have to follow. Some regions will hold on to their regional differences for a while, but eventually the Missale Romanum will sweep across the West until there's not many other options left. The Roman Breviary is another attempt at uniformity. It eliminates diversity in the West. It's issued in 1568. It's an attempt to clean up and standardize the breviary. Not actually that dissimilar in sort of desire to simplify than Cranmer, although obviously Catholic instead of Swiss theologically informed. And everyone that's 200 years old or older can still do their own version of the breviary. But once again, this is the Pope deciding how everyone is going to pray the office for the entirety of the church. It's universalized how the clergy prayed across the Catholic world. So the importance of these tools for reform and for strengthening and solidifying Catholic identity can't be stressed enough. In addition, Jerome's Vulgate, there'll be a commission to fix that up, although that'll take a long time to finish, and it won't be finished until the pontificate of Sixtus the Fifth. But the also, you'll see issued in 1567 an official critical edition of Thomas Aquinas, which will become required readings for seminaries. So it really is starting in the 16th century that Thomas Aquinas will become the favored of all theologians for early modern Catholicism, even carrying us down into the 19th century, into the 20th century. Pius V also kind of browbeat Maximilian II and by threatening excommunication for him if he conceded anything to the Protestants. So Pius V was a fighter. Sort of a sign of his fighting is probably best seen at the victory of the Christian forces at the Battle of Lepanto, where the Turks were finally defeated for the first time. And this is at sea in a while, and this is October 7th, 1571, while Pius was praying the Rosary. So Our Lady of the Rosary is originally Our Lady of Victory, and the victory is at Lepanto. Philip II was an important help in this whole process of reforming the church, and worked very closely with Pius II, of course, always with an eye towards what was best for Spain as well. What we see with the pontificate of Pius V is a general trend on the part of the papacy, which is a move towards centralization, towards a not only a centralization, but a sort of normalization of what it means to be a Catholic and how Catholics pray, not just in Rome, not just in Italy, but across the entire world. It's not just Pius V that oversees this process of centralization, it's just he gets the ball rolling in such a great way. The most important kind of in terms of the governance of the papacy is going to be the passing of a Mensa Aeterna Dei by Sixtus V, which will robustly reorganize the papal curia, which is gives us pretty much a similarity to what we have today with the addition of a few additional congregations, but it's pretty close. But really, what we're going to see is the church, following the Council of Trent and Pius V, is going to move into a period of one of its largest moments of expansion and undertaking of the church since the first 5 centuries. The general trend that we will see emerge in early modern Catholicism is a trend to, as Carlos Ire says, worship uniformly, instruct thoroughly, and police intensely. This means that in the 16th and 17th century, we're going to enter into a long period of where centralization is demanded on paper, although local variety may still remain, but still the centralization on paper was now seen to be the normative position. That Pius V could tell people how to do the Mass, how to say the office, and what they should believe. It becomes a more normative idea. So the Catholic aspirations for this common identity became a powerful argument against the Protestants. As Francis de Sales would say to the Protestants, "You pretenders pass not the Alps on our side, nor the Pyrenees on the side of Spain. Greece knows you not. The other 3 parts of the world do not know who you are, and have never heard of Christians without sacrifice, without altar, without head, without cross. As you are in Germany, your comrades, the Lutherans, the Brentians, the Anabaptists, the Trinitarians, eat into your portion. In England, the Puritans; in France, the Libertines. How then can you be so obstinate and continue thus apart from the rest of the world?" So this communal identity gathered around the instruments of reform of the Missal, the Breviary, the Catechism will give the Church a great morale boost and confidence so in undertaking a response, especially to the Protestants. What you can say is that the Church, as she enters into the early modern period, realizes a global identity, and that'll in part also be due to the missions that we'll discuss next week as well. But in order to defend the church, we also have 2 institutions that are created, and one is the Index. So the Index, which is started under Paul I and renewed again with Pius V and will continue to be around, is the Index of Prohibited Books. This is books that you're not allowed to read without approval from your parish priest or other authorized individuals. And it's no more and no less than that. They're books that you can't read unless you're sufficiently prepared and ready to read. So this is censorship, but it's a question of, yes, it is paternalism, but it's a question of a recognition that the ideas are dangerous and you shouldn't read books with dangerous ideas until you're properly formed first. So when I was a younger man, I used to think that the idea of the Index of Prohibited Books was awful. But then when I became a father myself and realized the need for censorship, I have kind of a reformed idea, a changed vision of how I see the Index. The Index is a pastoral strategy in a way. It's meant to defend people against bad ideas. Sometimes it's run well, sometimes it's run poorly, the books that end up on the Index. But the idea behind the Index is that people shouldn't read things before they're ready. I sometimes wonder, if we had the power to keep the Communist Manifesto or the writings of Ayn Rand out of the hands of high school students before they read all of Catholic social teaching, would we do it? And my answer, probably as a father, is yes. I think I would make sure that my children knew Catholic social teaching before they read the extremes of the left and the right when it came to the political governance of the world. The other tool that is used in order to enforce Catholic discipline is, of course, the Inquisition, which will be not only an instrument for imposing doctrinal could be used not only for doctrinal defense, but could also be used for behavior. So the Inquisitions could also be used as an instrument for disciplining clerical behavior. So this is the Roman Inquisition that we talked about, but other nations will have their own Inquisitions as well, particularly in the Spanish world, and those are more under control of the state than under controls of the church. We really do see a great morale boost come during the pontificate of Gregory XIII as well, and that the Roman catacombs are sort of rediscovered at this time. And when they get down there, things don't look Protestant, things look Catholic. And so this is the relics go on parade all through town. Gregory the 13th is a great patron of scholarship, establishing schools, especially for the Protestant areas. He sponsored yet another Arabic translation of the Gospels. And this is also the Gregory of the Gregorian calendar, because in 1582, on the 5th of October, he declared it to be the 15th of October. And I've never been able to verify this, but Johannes Kepler, a Protestant, said, although he might be the Antichrist, the math is right. So it was Gregory fixed the calendar for the entire world. Most people went along with it, although actually England would resist the calendar change even though the math was right, until the 18th century. Gregory also oversaw a Jubilee year, which is sort of Rome was emerging once again as a leader of reform and emerging in a more robust outlook than the Italianization that occurred in the 15th century. And it's Sixtus V who will overhaul the Curia. So on the institutional side of things, the church has gone through quite a bit in the space of really about 50 years, from when Paul III calls the council in 1536 to the great reform measures that are being put in place, say with Sixtus V of 1588. The papacy has helped itself to emerge as once again a leader of reform for the world, but its authority is going to be much more geographically limited within Europe. But the institutional response of the church will consolidate and hold the Catholic areas that remain Catholic in Europe. And this consolidation will lead to a kind of more robust, more uniform Catholic identity. And that more robust Catholic identity can then be taken and spread across the globe, although it was already in the process of spreading from 1492 forward. So this is the institutional sort of response to the Protestants in terms of both papacy and council, but we can also look at other aspects of the response to the Protestants, which we'll do in the subsequent lecture, which is looking at kind of some of the overall trends of what early modern Catholicism was like. Thank you.